Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Josh. I'm from the National Weather Service in Duluth, Minnesota, and this video is being recorded on January 27th, 2024 at about 1 o'clock p.m. on a Saturday. And the purpose of this video is to talk about this kind of crazy winter we've been having so far. So this is going to be a January 2024 midwinter update. Basically, we're going to talk about is the very warm December we had with the brown Christmas. As you can see on the left here, it was warm enough and without snow you could mow your lawn if you wanted to, leading up into a little bit of cold in January, but now we're warm once again. And basically just talking about what we can expect for the rest of winter and going into early spring. So let's get into it here. First, let's just kind of talk about a broad brush summary of everything. We've had a very warm start to winter, especially in December. We actually had a wet start, above average precipitation in December as well, leading into the early part of January. And this is largely due to a strong El Nino. And this is something we had been talking about early on in the fall and early winter that was probably going to play a pretty major role in what kind of winter weather we had. And so far, that has certainly held true. We did have a temporary cold snap and a bit of active weather that brought some snowfall to the region in kind of the late, early to mid parts of January, let's say. And since then, up right until now, we've returned to warmer than normal weather, and we're kind of expecting that to persist on the whole through the rest of winter and into spring. Now stick around because we're going to get into more of the nitty-gritty details about that through this presentation. But what you see on these graphics on the right, here's the Climate Prediction Center outlooks from February through April, so basically late winter into fall, favoring above average temperatures and equal chances for above, below, or around normal precipitation. So we'll take a closer look at that towards the end of the presentation, but first let's talk about what got us to where we're at now by taking a look at what we had happen in December. December was very warm across the region. Temperatures about 10 to 15 degrees above normal across the region, as you can see on this map on the right, especially in northeastern Minnesota. That's where the heart of the warmth was felt. And if we take a look at some of the statistics for our 5 climate sites, basically temperatures around that 10 to 15 degree above average mark. And for International Falls, Hibbing, and Brainerd, they recorded the warmest Decembers on record. And Duluth and Ashland weren't too far behind, recording the second warmest Decembers on record. So just as a whole, it was very warm out there. Now, as far as precipitation went in December, we actually were above average, which is a bit different than usual for El Nino, but in this case we got plenty of rainfall with those warm temperatures. We didn't see a lot of snow, but we saw plenty of rain. This map in the middle here shows how this precipitation, which includes rain and melted snow, how it was distributed across the region. Totals ranging from about an inch to maybe 3 inches, approaching 4 inches some places. And this is actually well above normal, as you can see on the right. This is departure from normal. So especially around like the Brainerd Lakes and some of those areas, around 2 inches plus above normal. It's a lot of rain. And if we look at the actual numbers for some of our climate sites, International Falls was just a little above normal, but otherwise, we're running just about 2 inches to, in the case of Brainerd, 3.5 inches above normal. And a lot of that rainfall happened right around Christmas, where we had that storm that brought us persistent warm temperatures, no snow on the ground, as you can see on this next slide here, and just plenty of rain. So what did the snowfall look like in December? Well, there wasn't a whole lot of it. If we take a look at these maps on the right, this is basically modeled snow depth on Christmas Day this year in 2023 around the Northland. And as you can see, basically no snow anywhere, maybe just a trace to the northwest, but basically nothing. And this differs completely opposite from what we saw Christmas Day 2022, where we saw our snowiest December on record. We had widespread snowfall, snow depths of 1 to 2 feet across the region. Of course, we saw plenty of snow that entire month. If we take a look at the numbers for what we've seen this December versus the past December, we've just seen amounts that are just a fraction. And of course, we're about 13, 14 inches below average for December, whereas last year, at least in Duluth, we saw the snowiest December on record, 26.2 inches above average. Not too much above average in International Falls, but above average nonetheless. So it's been a completely different season, polar opposite of last year with snowfall. Now, let's take a look at what happened in January. Now, things in in December, we were pretty much above normal temperature-wise for the entire month. As we talk about temperature in January, there was a little bit more ups and downs. We were kind of hovering around average to a little bit above average for the beginning part of the month there. And that's when we actually started to get a little bit more precipitation in the form of snowfall. Then we took a little bit of a nosedive with the temperatures in the middle part of the month. We kind of saw an actual taste of winter here. And while I'm just showing the temperature graph here for Duluth, it's pretty representative of the region as a whole. So we took a bit of a nosedive in January. It gave us a taste of winter, some of that good old-fashioned northern Minnesota, northwest Wisconsin cold air. But in the past week or so, past several days especially, we've been warming well above average once again. And, right now we're seeing even low temperatures breaking records for record warm low temperatures in some parts of the region. So that's what we're dealing with up to this point. And this map you see on the right just shows that we have seen above normal temperatures as a whole throughout January, though not quite as much as it was in December with that mid-January cold spell. So how has precipitation fared so far? Well, at least in the early part of the month, and again, I'm showing a graph here of, let's see, this is total precipitation for the month of January in Duluth only, but it's pretty representative of most of the region. Basically, in that early part of January, we saw a bit of snowy weather. So we saw some precipitation that mostly fell as snow. Then we returned to mostly dry weather when we had that cold spell in the middle of the month. Then towards the end of the month, we got warm, but still dry. So that's essentially how the precipitation has, the timeline of it has gone so far around the Northland. As far as amounts go, they've been a little bit closer to average on the whole. So accumulated precipitation, places around Hinckley or so, just a few tenths of an inch to maybe about an inch up in the Arrowhead, and then the usual snow belts around Ironwood, those kinds of places. And as far as how this compares to normal, for most places, maybe just a touch below normal, maybe a little bit above normal in the Arrowhead, but roughly hovering around normal. And snowfall this month has been below average, so we're continuing with that trend that we saw in December, but maybe dampen just a little bit, because we did see a little bit of snowfall that actually brought some, modest snowpack to parts of the region, especially in the beginning parts of the month. So where we're sitting right now with current modeled snow depth in this top right map here is basically, places around Hinckley, down towards the Twin Cities, not a whole lot of snow, maybe just trace amounts up to an inch here and there. Get towards Duluth, the Iron Range, 2 to 4, up to 6. Some of those amounts are kind of more common in this area. Some of the more snowy locations include the North Shore and then also the South Shore areas around Lake Superior, the higher terrain, the usual places that are more snowy. But no matter where you go, the snow has been below average. So let's just take a look at some numbers for fun here. Duluth and International Falls, running about 3 to 5 inches below average for just January snowfall. And where does that set us up for, our seasonal snowfall to date? This is among one of the very dry years that we've seen, basically Duluth and International Falls, but across the region as a whole. So we're sitting, 20 to 30 plus inches below average for snowfall. Duluth has only seen 17.1 inches of snow for the entire season. Recall from just December of last year when we broke the record. What was that amount? I got to go back to that last slide. And that was 44.9 inches just for the month of December. We've seen 17.1 for the entire season so far. So quite a stark contrast. This graph on the right here shows basically accumulated snowfall for Duluth, but pretty representative of the entire region for a few select years. So in this green color, that's what we've seen so far this year with our 17.1. Now, up to this date last year, we've seen 80.1 inches. So we haven't even seen 1/4 of the amount of snowfall that we saw last year. Now, last year was the extreme year. That was the snowiest winter on record in Duluth, of course. But on average, we by this date, we would normally see about 50.3. So even with that, we've seen less than half of the normal snowfall that we usually see for this time of year. And then one of the least snowiest winters on record was 1980 to 1981 at the Duluth Airport location, where to this date they saw 11.5 inches. And for the total that year, I think they were 36.5. So we're definitely leaning closer to that, lower end of snowfall trajectory as opposed to last year where we were the highest on record. And just taking a look at some maps regionally for snowfall, and this is season to date, right up until that I'm making this presentation. So on the left, you can see accumulated snowfall around the region, below normal everywhere, but some of the higher amounts have been in some of the usual places, Iron Range into the Arrowhead, and then also along the South Shore around Ironwood and into the UP of Michigan. So that's where some of the higher amounts have been. But again, if you take a look at departure from average in the middle here, we're still looking at pretty widespread 10 to 30 inches or so below average, maybe even some pockets of 40, approaching 40 to 40 inches below average. But then some of the hardest hit places, since it's been so warm out, there's been a lack of lake effect snow, especially along the South Shore. So places around Ironwood and into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, looking at 50 plus inches below normal. And how does that compare to the percent of normal for this time of year? Essentially, like I said, around Duluth, we've seen less than 50% of the snowfall that we normally see by this date, on average, that we've seen this year. So no matter where you go, we're 10 to 25 or 30% of average. It's just, there's just not been a lot of snow, to summarize that. So some people may be curious, okay, so it's been a very warm winter. We've got the El Nino, and that kind of explains a lot. But what caused that flip in January, where we got that week or so of cold temperatures, basically a real taste of winter around the Northland? So let's just talk a little bit of science real quick. I'm sure a lot of people have heard the term polar vortex. It's been in the news the past several years and all this. So let's actually take a minute or two and talk about what the polar vortex is. And basically what it is, it's a strong band of winds in the stratosphere surrounding the North Pole about 10 to 30 miles above the surface. So the polar vortex itself isn't weather that we can actually experience here on the surface. This is many miles above the surface, and it circles around the North Pole. And essentially what this is, when we have a stable polar vortex, in other words, the usual case, we have a west to east flow that's fairly circular or so around the North Pole. It keeps that cold air generally contained to around the North Pole. But at times during the winter, we can have a disrupted polar vortex. And how do we get a disrupted polar vortex? Well, it's a little tricky, but essentially we have planetary waves of ridges and troughs, and we're talking broad scale ridges and troughs that can interact with the parts of the stratosphere. And basically that can cause the stable polar vortex to become disrupted. It can kind of break into pieces. It can become, even in some more extreme cases, break into like pieces of two, where it basically becomes very disjointed. And when that happens, there's kind of a delayed effect where this will affect the weather that happens in the lower parts of the atmosphere, the weather that we experience. So when the polar vortex becomes disrupted, we call it sudden stratospheric warming. Essentially, when that happens, it causes these winds to slow down from the usual case. They slow down, and in some cases, they can actually reverse direction. When that happens, you have a better chance that you're going to see cold air outbreaks moving south from the northern areas, and then in between that, you have a better chance of warm air moving up from the south. So when you have a disrupted polar vortex, and we can see this coming, once we start to observe it, we can kind of predict ahead of time, basically on the scale of about a month or so, that we might start to see a more active weather pattern where we might see some cold air outbreaks impacting northern parts of the world. That could include Canada and the United States, but also parts of Europe and that sort of thing. So the locations are not always easy to predict, but we can predict if we see a disrupted polar vortex, there's a greater likelihood in the near future that we might see some cold air outbreaks starting to occur at some point in the near future. So what happened in January? We did have a sudden stratospheric warming event in December that led to a disrupted polar vortex, and this was partially to blame for the colder air spilling into the Northland in mid-January. Now, this wasn't the only thing that caused cold air to happen. We had some other ocean atmospheric teleconnections, such as the Madden-Julian Oscillation and some other things that are kind of beyond the scope of this presentation to talk about. But this is one aspect that kind of helps to explain why we got cold in January, despite the fact that we're dealing with an El Nino, and that, as a whole tends to bring warmer weather to the Northland. So we've talked about kind of what led us to where we're at now. Let's talk about where we are now. And one way to kind of look at that in kind of a fun way is something called the Accumulated Winter Season Severity Index, in short AWSSI. This comes from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center. It's basically a measure of the persistence of cold weather, the amount of snow, and the amount and persistence of snow on the ground. So basically you take these factors, add them up in kind of like a point system, and it kind of is a way to rank how severe winter has been up to this point. So I've got a few fun graphs on the right here. This one on the top right shows basically for Duluth, but again, pretty representative of the entire region. So if you add up where we're at so far this year in the black line, it's been a very mild winter season. In fact, up into the early part of January before we got our cold snap, this was the most mild winter we've had, based on this point system that we've had ever, essentially. Now, once we had that cold snap in the middle of the month, things kind of started to get us back into that kind of lower end mild category, not necessarily breaking the record, but we're pretty darn close. Now this compares starkly with last winter, where basically for the entire season we were ranked in this severe range and ended the season kind of borderline extreme with all of that snow. And there was some cold last, and we had plenty of snow cover on the ground for pretty much the whole of winter, which is polar opposite this year. Now this one on the bottom right, I wanted to rank how this year compares with the 5 most recent strong to very strong El Nino winters. And the reason I wanted to show you guys this is basically just to highlight that, just because we have an El Nino doesn't mean it's going to be the same as every other El Nino that we've seen in the past. There are some similarities, but they're not always the same. So the past 5 El Ninos that were strong to very strong, kind of similar to this one that we're experiencing, have had quite a range of how severe the winter impacts have been. And if you go to the far right, as we get to the end of the winter season, some seasons ended in that kind of severe category. Most of them were kind of clustered around kind of moderate intensity. So they can vary quite a bit, and that's the whole point of showing that. So where are we at with the El Nino this winter? This is one of the stronger El Ninos that we've seen, and what we typically see with an El Nino is we get warm air intrusions and less precipitation. This is not always the case, as I kind of showed in that previous slide, but most often, if you average, what we've seen in the past for the period that we have weather records going back, that's kind of the rough average. And we've certainly seen those warm air intrusions this year. Precipitation with all that rain we saw in December, we're kind of around average thus far. We had a little bit of a partial exception with, where we broke free of that really warm typical El Nino condition with some cold weather and a little bit of snow in January. But now we've rebounded right back to where we are with very warm temperatures at the current time. So typically, this top right map, you can see what we usually experience with an El Nino. It's pretty similar to what we've seen this year. The polar jet stream tends to stay to the north, and the Northland is kind of typically on the edge where there's a little bit of variability, but generally warmer than normal temperatures. So that's kind of where we're at this point. Now, what can we expect going forward? I've got this plot on the bottom right here, and this basically shows a probability as we go in through the rest of winter into the summer, and then at the very end, early fall, the probability that we're going to see El Nino, a neutral condition, or La Nina. So from the Climate Prediction Center, the odds are highly in the favor of keeping this El Nino around through the rest of winter and into the early part of spring. So right around, that March, April timeframe or so. At that point, as we get into the spring, the odds are tilted in the favor of an ENSO neutral condition. Now, there's something called the spring predictability barrier, where essentially the models that forecast this kind of stuff, things become a little bit more dicey. So as we go forward from that, predictability is quite a bit less. But with that all said, there's a slight trend as we go towards the late summer, maybe early fall, that we might see, odds a little bit in the favor of a La Nina. Now, this is definitely not a guarantee, but the one thing that we do have going in this favor is that in the past, previous El Ninos, especially the strong ones, tend to have the following winter either be a neutral condition or a La Nina condition. So, part of climatology is in the favor of us potentially going into either a neutral or La Nina phase as we go into, potentially next fall, that sort of thing. Predictability is low at this time. I will, hold pretty firm to that, but that's kind of the potential trend. So, with that said, as we are expecting El Nino to continue for the rest of the winter, warm and dry conditions are, we're likely to see predominantly that, but we may see some other short-term teleconnections that may sway the weather pattern towards the cold and snowy. Maybe another taste of winter, perhaps. We can't rule that out. Ice cover on Lake Superior as a result of all this warm weather has been pretty minimal. If we take a look at what we've got out there right now, we've got little bits and pieces of ice along the south shore, but generally it's kind of patchy out there. There's not a whole lot of it. And if we take a look at the average ice concentration on Lake Superior as a whole, near the lowest it's been on record through early January with all that warm weather. Now we started to see an uptick of ice cover once we had that cold weather in the middle of January, but just not a lot of ice out there with those warm temperatures. Okay, so now it's time to project forward a little bit. Let's talk about the weather, and then let's talk about basically what are the odds tilted towards as we go into the rest of winter and early spring. So let's just take a look at the next 7 days first off. I mentioned before, we've warmed right back up to well above average temperatures around the Northland. We're expecting to see that persist for the next week at the very least. Just taking a look at our 7-day forecast for high temperatures, no matter where you are in the region, highs in the 30s, above freezing, and probably going to be seeing some highs in the 40s, especially as we get to the middle and later part of next week. So it's going to be warm out there. We can expect some of the snow, what little snow we have, to start melting out there, continue melting. And even the low temperatures, if you look at these, we're not going to be dropping that far off. We're looking at lows falling into the 20s, in many cases upper 20s around the Northland. So we can probably going to see a few sporadic warm low temperature records, continuing to be in jeopardy in the next week with just very, very warm temperatures across the scale. As far as precipitation chances over the next week, we're looking at pretty slim pickings out there, maybe a few chances for some light flurries or so going into Monday and Tuesday, and maybe a slight chance for a little bit of mixed precip towards next weekend, but just really not a very active weather pattern as far as that goes. Just pretty typical, what you'd expect with an El Nino for the next week is just this warm and fairly dry pattern. Now, if we go forward beyond that, we're going to take a look at some Climate Prediction Center outlooks. So this takes us into the early part of February, 3 through 9. And as you can see in this 8 to 14-day temperature outlook on the top left here, greatly favoring above average temperatures to continue. And I've got some little pie charts here in the bottom left. This is for Duluth, but representative of the rest of the region. About 80% confidence that we're going to see above normal temperatures. Precipitation, there's a slight favor towards above normal precipitation in this early February period. So maybe we'll see the storm track pattern become a little bit more active, but confidence is quite a bit lower in this actually happening compared to the temperatures. It's only about 40% confidence in favor of above normal precipitation. So it might happen, where odds are tilted towards that slightly, but it's definitely not a sure thing. Now, as we go a little bit further in time, as we take a look into the middle of February, as far as the temperature trends go, like I was saying, despite the overall El Nino pattern favoring above normal temperatures, there are some hints out there in different long range models that we could see some cooler weather, perhaps another taste of winter perhaps making its way to the Northland around approximately the middle part of February or so. Definitely not a guarantee. We're looking at equal chances. Temperatures could be above normal, below normal, or right around normal. But if it's going to happen at any time, probably more likely around middle February or so. And a slight trend favoring below normal precipitation in this time period. Now for February as a whole, if we look at that outlook, definitely a slight favor towards above normal temperatures and kind of mixed equal chances for above, below, or around normal precipitation. So a lot of what you see in this graph on the left for temperatures, above normal. We're experiencing that essentially right now. So, if we're going to see any chances for below normal temperatures or temperatures around normal again with perhaps another taste of winter, that's going to be more likely towards the middle to perhaps maybe later part of the month. And if we take a look at the outlooks throughout the spring, so this is February, March, and April, this is where we're talking about things as a whole, and we have a slight odds are slightly tilted towards above average temperatures, and this is definitely as a result of that the high probability of El Nino continuing. So, what we can expect with this is overall above average temperatures. We might see some cooler periods here and there, but as a whole, tending towards above average. And the further out we go in time, the less predictable we are, especially with things like precipitation. So in this case, there's not a lot of guidance that's hinting, swing either way extremely towards above, below, or around average precipitation. So we don't have very high confidence in precipitation trends at this time. So with that all said, what could we be looking at as far as drought conditions? Let's take a look at what we're dealing with currently out there. Obviously, over the past couple of years, we've been dealing with quite a bit of drought across the Northland. It's kind of been improving here and there. With some of that December rain, we've seen some short-term improvements, especially like around the Twin Ports, let's say, and parts of the North Shore. Not really recording any drought conditions as far as the last update on the January 23rd there, but there's still some pockets of abnormally dry and even up to severe drought, around the Brainerd Lakes and parts of northwest Wisconsin. So it's still out there, definitely. And with the low predictability of precipitation chances that we have going over the next few months as a whole, it's looking more likely that places that are seeing drought right now probably going to see that drought persist through the next few months into the early part of spring. And then other places that are not experiencing drought, probably not, we don't have any strong confidence either way that we're going to, necessarily see things go towards or away from a drought. So that's kind of a quick look at drought. Now, what about hydro trends? A lot of people are probably curious about, the potential for spring flooding, river flooding, that sort of thing as the snow starts to melt. So let's just take a look at where we sit with that right now. Now, currently, snowpack is well below average since we've seen snowfall well below average. This map on the top right here shows model snow depth departure from average across the region. And no matter where you go, we're well below average. And as far as model snow to liquid equivalent, that map is on the bottom right here. For most places, we're sitting at an inch or less of, if you were to take all the snow that's on the ground and melt it down into liquid, an inch or less for most places, a little bit more than that, perhaps in scattered areas in where places have seen a little bit more snow in the Arrowhead and parts of the South Shore. But generally, with that all said, with the little snowpack that we have, we're looking at, spring flooding risks looking potentially low at this time. Now, this could change if we happen to trend a little bit higher in the next few months with rain or snowfall. That remains a little bit more uncertain at this time. But at this time, with all things considered, spring flooding risks are looking low. And we can see basically stream flows around the region, Minnesota and Wisconsin, kind of variable with all that December rain we had. So some places are kind of running above normal, some places below normal. But overall, all things considered, with the data that we have now, spring flooding risks are low. We will have more updates coming with that in the next several weeks to months as we follow what weather patterns we actually start to see with precipitation. Some of the last things I wanted to show you are just some actual observations out there. We greatly appreciate the reports that we get, especially from our Koskar Ross. Koskar Ross will have a slide showing what that is coming up here, but our co-op observers, we have all kinds of observers that tell us how much snow is out there, how much rain they've got, and that sort of thing. And so these are some observations over the past 3 days or so, 3-4 days around the Northland, showing you what the snow depth is around the region. And basically what you can see is very little around, Hinckley, Sandstone, Moose Lake, those areas, up to an inch. And up to maybe 3 to 6, some locally higher amounts, especially around the Arrowhead there. But, as far as snowfall goes, what we have on the ground right now, we're below average, and snow to liquid equivalent, basically if you were to melt that snow down, we don't have quite as many reports of this. That's a little bit more of a challenge to get those reports. But from what we do have, especially we have plenty of reports up in the Arrowhead here. Many of these were taken by a few meteorologists here from the Weather Service at Duluth, in fact. But we have a few reports up there, basically hovering around 1 inch. So, and essentially that's we're quite a bit below average where we normally are this time of year with those. But I just wanted to show you what the actual numbers are looking like out there. So if you're interested in weather, this one way that you can be a part of the whole thing is to consider joining Koskar Ross. So what is Koskar Ross? Koskar Ross is an acronym that stands for the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. It's a grassroots network of volunteers. Doesn't matter what age you are, if you're young, you're old, or in the middle. Essentially, if you have an interest in weather and you're interested in recording precipitation, whether it's rainfall, snowfall, or mixed precipitation, we'll take it. We love it all. And basically what you do is you go to koskarross.org, you'd sign up and get a standard rain gauge, as you can see on these images here on the top right. Get a standard rain gauge and just put it up in your backyard and start measuring precipitation. It's that easy. So your data gets used all over the place by us at the National Weather Service, River Forecast Center, state climatologists, emergency managers. A lot of people use this data, so you can really become part of this if you're interested. And it's quick and easy to sign up. So if you have an interest in weather and you're interested in observing precipitation, I highly encourage that you would join Koskar Ross, and koskarross.org again is the place to go for that. If you have any questions, you can also ask us here at the Weather Service too. So let's wrap things up here. What can we expect? Let's talk about things that we have high confidence about and things that we're less certain about as we talk about this forecast for the rest of winter and into early spring. So what we have high confidence in and what we're expecting is that we're expecting this strong El Nino to persist through the rest of winter and into early spring, and then potentially transitioning into this neutral phase that we might stick with through the summer. So with this, the odds are tilted slightly towards overall warmer temperatures through the rest of winter and early spring. There's pretty high confidence that we're going to see above average temperatures, especially in the next week or two. After that, there's some chances that we could potentially see some additional outbreaks of some colder weather, perhaps snowier weather. Less confidence as we get further out, but like I said, winter's not done around the Northland. We might still see another round of some of that snowy cold weather, another last taste of winter before we start getting into that spring stuff. So what are things that we're less certain about? Well, predictability of rain and actual snowfall amounts over the next few months. There's just less confidence with that overall with the El Nino pattern and other ocean atmospheric teleconnections out there. So what we can expect is we're probably going to see periods of dry weather, especially like we're seeing in the next week or so, and then intermixed with that some periods of potentially wet or snowy weather. So that's what we can look at with that. And as we time out warmer, cold periods over the next few months, like I said, confidence decreases over time, but there's maybe some medium confidence, about 40% chance that we could see some cooler weather potentially returning in the middle to later parts of February. So possibly could see another taste of winter there. Not a total guarantee, but odds are slightly leaned that way. And just overall, odds, I just want to kind of highly emphasize, like I mentioned a few times throughout this, that El Nino winters are not all the same. So while we are seeing the odds slightly tilted towards this warmer weather on the whole, continuing throughout the rest of the season, it's not a guarantee, and we're probably going to see some periods where it's a little bit colder and potentially rainy or snowy. So that kind of wraps up this presentation. I hope that information is useful for you all. If not, especially taking a look at some of those climate stats at the beginning of the presentation, hopefully found that kind of fun to check out. So this is one of the first types of presentations we've done like this. I don't know that we've ever done a midwinter kind of video or presentation like this before. So if you have any questions or feedback about this presentation, we're going to be sharing it Facebook and Twitter or X. We're going to be sharing it all around. And if you want to drop us a comment or send us a message, we'd like to hear what you think about the information in this presentation? Do you like it? Is it useful for you? Basically, just let us know. We've got a bunch of contact information, so if you have weather questions, we're here. We work 24 hours a day. There's always a meteorologist here who's happy to answer weather questions for you if you have them. So feel free to give us reach out to us and if you have any questions. With that said, I want to thank you very much for joining us on this Saturday afternoon, January 27th, 2024, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.